Well, we are in our study titled Heroes, and this morning we're actually wrapping it up after about 9 months. And by the way, in my mind, it started out to be a 3-month series, but we got a little carried away. It was so good and so rich, we just couldn't turn it off. You know, we were using Hebrews chapter 11 as our guide, and you read through that list of names, and it's the all-star lineup. You know, it's these incredible men and women who have gone before us. We are here in large part because of the groundwork that they laid, so their lives are worthy of study. Well, this morning we wrap it up with the story of a woman named Ruth. Her story is short. You can read her account in the book titled After Her, Ruth. It'll only take you about 15 minutes, and I have a feeling that once you read it, you're going to want to read it again. It's an amazing, amazing story of life transformation, of God's sovereignty at work in her life. She was an immigrant. And she gave up her definition, the culture's definition, of the good life and exchanged it for a life following God. And what God did was changed her definition of a good life and actually gave her a better life. If you've ever made a major cultural change or a move, you know how difficult it can be. When my son was in junior high, 5 or 6 years ago, my youngest son, he was given a class project, and that class project had him identifying an early ancestor who immigrated to the United States. And so this is the result. From Stuttgart to Scottsdale, John George Fritz, a young man in the 1850s living in Stuttgart, wanted a better life. So he left Stuttgart, headed toward Amsterdam, got on board a merchant ship, landed in New York, and from New York he settled in Ohio and became a farmer. Why? Because he wanted a better life. Ruth's story is a bit different than John George's because, as I said, Ruth actually gave up the definition, her own definition of a better life, and exchanged it for God's definition, and in the end ended up with the life that she truly wanted. Her story begins with her mother-in-law. Her name was Naomi. And Naomi was married to a man named Elimelech. And they lived in Bethlehem. But because of a famine, they moved from Bethlehem to Moab. And in Moab, they had 2 sons. Sons grew up, got married, and married 2 Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. And then tragedy hits. The men die. Elimelech dies. Ruth's husband dies. Orpah's husband dies. Now, it's just the ladies. And Naomi in particular is in a very vulnerable position. If you know anything about being a widow back in that time, especially at her age, very, very vulnerable. In that day, family was everything. In fact, it's going to sound strange to us, but really, you did not marry for love or companionship. You know why you married? You married to have a family. Family was everything. And within the family, boys were especially important because they were your safety, they were your security, they were your labor force, they were your retirement plan. They were the ones who would take care of you as you got older. So now here's Naomi. She's an aging widow, and she has nothing. Nothing. She's got her 2 daughter-in-laws. So together they decide, let's go back to Bethlehem. It appears that the famine is over. And on the way, Naomi looks at her daughter-in-laws and says, you know, it's actually better for the 2 of you if you stay here in Moab. Let me go alone. Let me go back to my homeland alone. And Orpah agrees. She remains in Moab. But Ruth, she won't let it go. She turns to her mother-in-law and says this. Chapter 1, verse 15, it's there in your notes. Naomi said to Ruth, see, your sister-in-law, that's Orpah, has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you." And this is a pretty famous couple lines, what we're going to read next. It's often repeated in marriage ceremonies and vows. "For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." What we're about to read next is the part that kind of gets left out in a lot of marriage ceremonies. "Where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Now, why would Naomi tell Ruth and Orpah, "Stay behind"? The answer is simple. It's to give them any hope of having a better life. They were young. They could remarry. There's safety, there's security there. Additionally, and most importantly, Orpah and Ruth were Moabites. In fact, you'll see it now as we read the text. All throughout the text, Ruth is referred to as Ruth the Moabitess. That's an important detail and mentioned over and over again for a reason, and here's why. Israelites and Moabites did not like each other. To an Israelite, the only good Moabite was a dead Moabite. Naomi understands this and says, "Ruth, let me just tell you, daughter, it's going to be much better for you to stay in Moab. Find a nice young Moabite man, marry him, have a family. You can start your life over again, but for me, I'm too old to do that. I'm going to go back to Bethlehem. But for you to come with me would be a great risk. For you as a Moabite to enter the land of the Israelites as a foreigner, that's going to be very, very difficult for you. Stay here. Don't come with me." But Ruth is having none of it. She says, "Your God will be my God. I'm giving up the Moabite gods for the Israelite God. Where you go, I will go. And the only thing that's going to separate us is death." You're sort of getting a nod here to the kind of friendship, the kind of character, the kind of person Ruth is, but you're about to find out more. Once they get to Bethlehem, Ruth makes a suggestion to Naomi. Chapter 2, verse 1. "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's who was a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech." That was her husband, whose name was Boaz. So they got a relative back in Bethlehem. "And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor.' And she said to her, 'Go, my daughter.' So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech." So the situation is obviously very desperate. Here are these ladies, they're traveling. Ruth is a foreigner, but yet they need to eat, right? I mean, they're hungry. They're going to starve to death. And so Ruth says, "Mom, I have this idea. I hope you'll agree. Let me glean. Let me glean." What is that about? Well, according to Levitical law, and this was a provision set therein by God in order to take care of the poor, a farmer was to leave the edge of his fields in order for the poor to enter and take what was there so that they could survive, so that they could eat. The farmer could reap all the area except for the outer edges, and that's where you would find poor people on the outskirts, picking what was left over, what was left behind, so that not so that they could sell it and make a profit, but so that they could stay alive. And so Ruth says, "How about if I go and I glean?" And what happens is remarkable. Within the sovereignty of God, she ends up in the field of Boaz, who is a relative. Verse 4, "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, 'She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. In other words, the worker says, look, boss, she's a foreigner. Not only is she a foreigner, but she's from Moab. And she said this to us, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for just a short rest. So Boaz is impressed. Verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? Now, this is a good dude. As a Moabite, she's fair game. But he tells his workers, don't mess with her. Don't touch her. And when you are thirsty, you go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. This is great kindness, very generous with her. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, because I'm a foreigner? You get the picture that's being painted here? She recognizes this kind of kindness, this kind of grace is not to be expected, but she's receiving it. By the way, grace changes everything. More about that in a second. But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. I've heard your story and how you left your father and mother in your native land. And that was a big deal back in the day. In our day, we get on planes and we travel all over the world. But back then, you were born, raised, and you died in your hometown. You talk about extreme prejudices in the world. If you were a foreigner entering a foreign town, they looked at you with great suspicion. You left all that behind. Give up your definition of what the good life is because of your friendship, because you wanted her God to be your God, because you wanted to be counted amongst her people. So the Lord repay you for what you have done, verse 12, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And this is great because Boaz says, the Israelite God is your God, and you're under his wing of protection. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. All the single ladies, listen to me for 1 second. I want you to notice something here. What is it that has attracted? What is it about Ruth that Boaz is drawn to? See it? It's her character. It's who she is on the inside. One of the great lies of our culture and society is that you must adjust your standards in order to get a man. Lower those standards, and the pond begins to open up to you. Anytime you lower your standard, you will begin to attract a man who has lower standards. My best piece of advice to people who are single and want to get married: first, concentrate on being the kind of person you want to marry. And then a remarkable thing happens. That person begins to find attraction in you. Now, don't get me wrong, right? The Bible puts it all in perspective and in balance. The Bible says, not let your adorning be merely external, but also internal. The things of the heart. It's Ruth's character that this good man Boaz notices. Why? How? How does he come to appreciate her character? Because he has great character. What he's about to do is going to come at tremendous cost to him. And yet it's because of his character that he pays that price. So she's astounded that a man would be open to a poor and marginalized woman. That day could not have gone any better, but in fact it does. She goes home to tell her mother-in-law, Naomi, you're not going to believe what happened to me. And then she gets this response in chapter 2, verse 19. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. And if you can imagine an elderly widow with all the enthusiasm that she has, she says, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our Goel. Goel, that's the Hebrew word, redeemer. This man is Goel. He's redeemer. Naomi says, Ruth, do you know who Boaz is? He's one of our redeemers. Now, what does that mean? He's one of our redeemers. Well, in Leviticus chapter 25, Joshua distributes the land to families, making it equitable. But hard times can come, and a family can lose what they once had. How do you maintain sort of that equality? How do you keep the rich from becoming too rich, the poor from becoming too poor? How do you bridge that gap? Well, one way you do that, the way God saw fit to do it, is every 50 years the land goes back to its original owner. Every 50 years. Additionally, land could be bought back into the family, but only by a redeemer, someone known as a kinsman redeemer. This is what Boaz is. He's kin. He has the ability to buy back what was once owned by the family, by Elimelech, Naomi's husband. He has the ability to do that. And this is where Ruth has been working. And now Naomi's like, wow, this is too good to be true. Question, is he willing to do it? Is Boaz willing to pay the price, to go through what it's going to take in order to get that land back? Naomi says, Ruth, this could be far better than you realize if he's willing to do so. Now, there are two major obstacles to this. Since Ruth has no descendants, Boaz is going to have to marry her. Not only is he going to have to marry her, he's going to have to father her children. Not only will he father her children, but those children are going to take on the name of her first deceased husband. That's a pretty high price. Secondly, Ruth is a Moabite. These are major hurdles. And yet, Ruth is willing to take a risk, knowing that God has brought her this far. Now, this is going to sound like a strange custom. Essentially, Naomi's going to tell Ruth, see if he's open. See if he's open to it. And this is what happens in chapter 6, or in verse 6. So Ruth went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then Ruth came softly and uncovered his feet and lays down. Picture this scene in your head. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, because you are a redeemer. Now, how's this going to play itself out? To say, spread your wings, literally cover me with your garment, is a way of saying, marry me. Marry me. You are my only hope. You're a kinsman redeemer. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet, there is a redeemer nearer than I. In other words, you have a relative that's actually closer than I am. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So Ruth finds Boaz, uncovers his feet, lays there. He wakes up. Who are you? I'm Ruth. Marry me. He says, I will, but there's a closer relative. So here's what happens. Boaz is a man of immediate action. The next day, he's at the the gates of the city. And as this closer relative comes in, grabs him, pulls him aside, and says, hey, listen, here's the deal. Explains the situation and says, you are the closest kinsman redeemer. Are you down? He says, I'm in. And at that point in the story, you're kind of like, oh man, shoot, no, we wanted Ruth and Boaz to get together, right? Man, this doesn't feel right. This isn't how the story is supposed to end. I mean, Boaz is the man. He's a good dude, right? And then Boaz says to the guy, oh, one other thing. Forgot to tell you. She's a Moabite. And the guy says, I'm out. Not doing that. Boaz says, then I will. In one moment, Ruth receives much more than she could have ever imagined. What Boaz does is give her a life at his great personal expense. Ruth inherits his wealth legally the moment they are married. Her debt is completely and totally paid for, and she receives an inheritance. Remember that. Now, how does all this come about? What's the point? What are some of the underlying threads and themes in this remarkable story? It happened because she did not expect a better life. Let me read it to you again in chapter 1. Do not urge me to leave you, Ruth says, or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Naomi tries to persuade her, don't follow me, go away. And Ruth says, I'm going with you, even if it means that I die with you. Now here's what's interesting. In verse 17, when Ruth uses the word Lord, may the Lord do so to me, and more so also, if anything but death parts me from you. We talked about this last week with Rahab. She's using the word Yahweh. See, there is a generic word for God, and it's the word Elohim. But when you want to get personal, you use the word Yahweh. And that's what Ruth is doing. Your God will be my God. And what's remarkable is that Ruth follows through and says, I need to be with the people of God. Now, because of this, she's given the highest praise. Let me read it and I'll explain it to you. Chapter 4, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife, and he went into her. And the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. They look at Naomi as this aging widow and like, how lucky are you, right? Actually has nothing to do with luck. We don't believe in luck. We believe in divine sovereignty. Blessed be the Lord, Naomi, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you, here it is, than 7 sons, has given birth. Your daughter is worth more than 7 sons. This is the highest compliment Ruth could be paid. As I said, sons were everything. They were your labor force. They were your security, your protection, your retirement. Ruth is better than 7 of them. 7 is the number of perfection. If you had 7 sons, you were the man. You had the ultimate family. Ruth is better than 7 sons. Why? Because of what she did. Because of what she did. All of these barriers are broken in this book. It's just incredible. It's like line after line. You're like, oh no, this is bad. She's a Moabite. Barrier is gone. Oh no, she's an aging widow. Barrier is gone. All these barriers are blown away. You know what? You know what blows away all barriers in life? One simple word. And it's the very thing that Christians ought to be known for. Grace. Grace. It breaks all barriers. You know what grace does in your life, and it's so powerful? It sets you free from those annoying voices of the world that tell you, you've got to be this, you have to do this, you have to own this, you have to pursue this. Grace is just that settled comfort that your worth has already been determined, because the ultimate expression of grace has Jesus on the cross, which is another way of God saying, you are worth a son to me in spite of who you are. You know what makes a great marriage? What makes a great marriage, ultimate marriage, is when you're able to look inside someone's heart and you're like, man, it's like, Jill does this with me a lot. We've been married for 25 years. She has the ability to look into my heart and see all of the junk, all of the dysfunction. And you know what she says? I see it, and I love you. And I love you. That's grace. That's what grace does, man. When Christians are people of grace, there are no barriers, whatever. She's a Moabite. See, it's your ethnicity, it's your race. Gone. She's a female. It's gone. So when Christians are people of grace, do you understand that? That's sort of the meta-narrative of this story is when you're a person of grace, you blow any of those barriers that try to separate people, that keep people down, and Ruth was the recipient of that. By the way, Ruth was gracious with her mother-in-law. Talk about being a good friend. In fact, great friendships transform lives. Hey, check this out. If you're reading this book, let's say a rabbi is instructing you, and he says, okay, I want you to turn to the book of the friend. Well, if you're a Hebrew, you know exactly where you're going. You're going to the book of Ruth. You know what? You know what the name Ruth means? Friend. The title of this book could be Friend. Is that awesome? How good of a friend was Ruth to Naomi? You know, great friendships. Would you rather have great food or great friends? Would you rather have great friends or a great big house? Would you rather have great friends or a great fast car? Would you rather have great friends or great preaching? You'd rather have great friends. You know why? Because your great friends are going to help you apply whatever preaching you hear. You may only have a small handful of these friends. One of our core values here at Illuminate is community. Why? Because we take this seriously. That's the soil in which your spiritual roots can grow deeper, and you will form great friendships. Friendships are the very things that move the heart most. Great preaching can inspire and motivate and move the heart and educate. But let me tell you something. Great friendships will move your heart like nothing else. That's exactly what's happening here. Lastly, and I'll end with this. It's much better to say that you are on God's side than to ask him to be on your side. And I love it. Love it. Because Ruth says, I'm not asking for God to be on my side. I'm going to be on God's side. His people, my people. Where he leads, I go. This is the reason why so many Christians are frustrated, because they treat God like a little servant. And then they're really disappointed in God because, God's just not aligning with the plans. Once God aligns with the plans, then we got a good God. Many Christians expect a better life. Ruth says, I just want to be obedient. And it's through her obedience that she receives a better life. There's this great celebration at the end of the story, and I'll just summarize it for you, because Ruth has been redeemed by Boaz. But, all of this points to a greater Redeemer. The real Redeemer is yet to come. Last week when I closed out the life of Rahab, I said, it's remarkable because here's this prostitute. Barrier broken, by the way, because of grace. Here's this prostitute. And her name shows up on the very first page of the New Testament. Well, if you looked closely, Ruth's name is also there. Let me read it to you. And Salmon is the father of Boaz. This is Matthew chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. And Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. And Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of David, the king. What this is it's the ancestral tree. This is the lineage of Jesus Christ. In his lineage is included a prostitute and a Moabite. How does that happen? Because the text is screaming something at you. Grace. Friendships transform. Better to be on God's side than ask him to be on your side. It's awesome how the Bible strings all of these Old Testament characters together and has this huge neon sign that points totally to Jesus Christ. On almost every page you see it. It's all about Jesus. Jesus is a better Boaz. Jesus is a better Ruth. Jesus is a better Moses, a better David. You name it. It all points to Jesus. You have a Redeemer. You have someone that bought you back. And that came at a very high price. What's being communicated? God's incredibly deep love, his incredibly deep grace. Ruth looked at Naomi and said, only death will separate us. Jesus said, not even will death separate us. Trust God. Give up your definition of a good life. God will give you a better definition, and he'll give you a better life. Father, another just rich text we're so grateful for. God, I pray that by your Spirit, you just continue to speak to our hearts, Lord, that we would understand what it means to be gracious people and to step into that space and show it towards others because we really understand that we've received it from you first. Lord, for the friendships, we thank you for them. We pray that we would pursue them, that we would respond, that we would lower the walls, drop the pride, the ego, step into that space of vulnerability and begin to minister and move each other's hearts through genuine friendship, and that we would always be on your side. We ask it in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, and God's people said, amen.